Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a vice president here and the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security and the Arnold Cantor Chair. This afternoon's conversations on the 2016 threat landscape in cyberspace, and we'll take a look at the past year's major developments in cyber and also look ahead to the types of challenges and other things that we might expect in this domain. And this is part of our longstanding series on our monthly series called Cyber Risk Wednesdays. The purpose of that series is to convene cyber experts from various sectors to examine topics at the core of the mission of the Cyber Statecraft initiative here in the Brent Scowcroft Center in the Atlantic Council. Well, the past 12 months has certainly been a turbulent time in cyberspace. I imagine someone could have said that every year for the last 10 years, but it really has been. We've had major data breaches. We've had revelations of both commercial and government espionage and the use of cyber tactics as part of a broader military warfare set of developments. The year began with the fallout from the 2014 Sony hack. I can remember way back to then. It disclosed over 170,000 internal employee emails and marked the first time that the United States publicly accused another government of a cyber attack. Later in the spring, the U.S. government suffered its own and suffered its biggest data breach in its history against the Office of Personnel Management, which compromised the records of 22 million people. While high-profile activities like these have stolen the headlines, thousands of smaller data breaches have simultaneously obviously taken place around the world throughout the year, resulting in the loss of millions, if not billions, of records of private information and disrupting the operations of countless organizations. At the same time, it seems that nations are getting more and more comfortable with the use of offensive cyber capabilities to support their military operations in ongoing conflicts such as in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and Ukraine. And then we also had the European Court of Justice's rejection of the Transatlantic Safe Harbor Agreement earlier this fall. That showed that it is becoming more difficult even for some allied nations to cooperate and work with each other and build trust in cyberspace. Although attacks against government and private sector networks are certainly going to continue, I'm going to make a bold prediction and say cyber intrusions are going to continue in 2016 at the same rate or higher. There are some upsides certainly to 2015, so we want to look at opportunities and upsides as well. There's certainly growing public awareness of cyber threats and of privacy issues. They're at an all-time high. Companies are dedicating increasing resources to protecting their networks. And the United States and China were able to come together and sign a deal banning commercial cyber espionage only a few months after the OPM breach. We'll see how that plays out, and we'll certainly have that as a topic of discussion today. So the question is there even hope for a brighter year in cyberspace? With us to discuss what these trends and developments mean, what our main takeaways from the past year's headlines, which I've glanced over, are, and what we should prepare for in 2016 is a group of fantastic experts who bring insights and perspectives from very diverse viewpoints to this discussion. Their backgrounds range from national and international security to law, industry, and journalism. First, I am very excited to welcome Sean Newell from the Department of Justice. He is the Deputy Chief for Cyber in the Department's National Security Division, where he manages investigations and prosecutions of malicious cyber activities, including the indictment of 5 Chinese PLA officers way back in May of 2014. Seems like only yesterday. We're also joined by our own Jay Healy. He is Senior Fellow in the Cyber Statecraft Initiative here and Senior Research Scholar at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia. In addition to serving as the previous director of our cyber initiative here until earlier this year, he has worked on cyber issues since the 1990s at places like the White House, Goldman Sachs, and the U.S. Air Force. Additionally, we have Ellen Nakashima here. She is joining us as national security reporter for the Washington Post. She focuses on issues relating to intelligence and technology, as well as civil liberties, and most notably reporting on many of the past year's big cyber incidents, such as the OPM hack and the U.S.-China cyber deal. I follow her on Twitter and always watch when she writes up on some of these issues. And we also have Mark O'Hare here. He is the Director, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Security First Corporation with us today. Thank you very much for your partnership on this event, and we really very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on these issues as well. Mr. O'Hare has over 30 years of security experience and has held leadership positions in both the private sector in data security companies and the U.S. Navy, where we had a great talk, and he was responsible as the program executive officer for some of the major U.S. aircraft carriers, which I hope we get to discuss as well. The discussion will be moderated by Sarah Sorcher. She is Deputy Cybersecurity Editor of Passcode at the Christian Science Monitor. They are our media partner for the Cyber Risk Wednesday event series, so thanks also to Passcode for partnering with us as well. As editor for Passcode, Ms. Sorcher is responsible for covering technology and the internet, including issues such as privacy, security, and the business of cybersecurity. Before we start, I'd like to welcome also those who are following the discussion online. This is being live streamed. I encourage all of you to join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag ACCyber and at CSMPasscode. Our partner. And with that, I'd like to bring our panelists to the stage and start the discussion.
Well, thanks so much to all of you for being here and for the great introduction, Barry. I think that everybody in this room would agree that 2015 has been a pretty interesting year on the cyber front, from OPM to Ashley Madison. We've seen major breaches carried out by nation states and hacktivists. Hackers breached military networks, financial networks, and John Brennan's AOL account. So we've also seen some big steps forward in 2015, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. And to kick us off, I think that we should go down and hear from each of you in 1 minute or less. What do you think is the biggest threat that we'll face in 2016, or the biggest opportunity? That'll give us a chance just to kick us off, and then we'll dive more deeply into these issues before we get to your questions as well. So Mark, let's start with you.
Always great to go first. So let me first, before I answer that, let me shape it a little bit. 90% of all the data that exists today was created in the last 2 years. 25,000 petabytes of data is collected every single day. We're in a world of 7 zettabytes of data. We'll be at 35 zettabytes of data in about 5 years. So the biggest threat is the massive amounts of data that we are collecting and the very poor way we're protecting at the back end. Very few of our companies and people understand the value of the data they're collecting. Therefore, they're not protecting it properly. There's these collections of Internet of Things, the cloud, 500 million devices, going to 2.8 billion devices by 2020. Data is being collected at a massive rate. We want to do data analytics. We're commingling all that data, get information, but we're not protecting it. So I see the biggest threat is that we don't understand the value of our data. We're collecting it at massive rates, and we are not protecting it properly at the back end. And it just leaves us open and vulnerable on every front you can possibly think of. Healthcare, government, we see the tax, insurance industry, financial industries. We see the problem with Target and Sony. So it's just the proper way to protect our data is not understood.
Great. Ellen?
I think the biggest threat for next year will continue to be that of in cyberspace, economic espionage, which interestingly, though, also gives rise to possibly the biggest opportunity to make some headway, given some of the events that have taken place over the last 2 years in the United States. By that, I'm referring to various administration moves, starting with the indictments in May of 2014 by the Department of Justice of 5 Chinese military officers, followed by consistent, persistent expressions of concern and anger by President Obama, raised with President Xi Jinping in bilats, from Sunnylands to the G20 in St. Petersburg to the Hague Summit in 2014, I guess it was, and then again this year in the bilateral. And, of course, the threatened economic sanctions on Chinese entities or companies for benefiting by the use of stolen intellectual property and trade secrets. I think all of those moves together succeeded not in getting China to stop its commercial hacking, but in finally, I think, persuading them that, and they got the message that the United States is serious about this threat and will not will not tolerate it, will actually take steps to hold them accountable. To the point where President Xi Jinping in September at the summit with Obama pledged that China would not conduct economics espionage in cyberspace. Now, will they live up to that pledge? Many officials are rightfully skeptical, and it's going to be, if they do, a long, I think, road to that. I don't think they will stop overnight, but who would have thought a year ago that you would have seen the president of China making that pledge to the president of the United States in a summit, and to have him make it again in a summit of the richest and most powerful nations and economies at the G20. So I think we've seen some moves, incremental, but significant nonetheless, that are showing that the Chinese are starting to get the message. And it's a combination of these tools and measures by the United States, as well as with expressions of concern, I think, by others in industry and academia, that could start to move the needle next year.
Great. Definitely a rich topic that we'll get into, I'm sure, in this discussion. Jay?
Hey, it's my turn. I like what my fellow panelists came up with. I've got so I was an Intel guy, and so I've got a most likely worst case and a least likely worst case, which isn't quite as likely, but still worries me. On the one that I consider more likely, that we permanently reduce the future usefulness and utility of the internet through our reactions, well understood reactions to attacks in Paris, San Bernardino, and other places, that our security instincts to feel safe lead us to worse long-term national security outcomes because we spike the internet, we spike encryption in other areas that may or may not help us in the short term, but certainly limit. So our kids don't have an internet that's as good as the one that we have today because we take the wrong response to this moment. The one that I consider less likely, but potentially far worse, it's become almost a source of comfort to us that no one that really has the capability for really devastating cyber attack would really use it to take down the internet. My buddy Arnold Abraham's here. Back when we were doing Intel together, the rule of thumb was those with the capability lack the intent, those with the intent lack the capability. And to me, especially with the world's going now, that strikes me as a very 1914 argument. And especially if you've got Putin that might feel he has nothing left to lose by overturning the table. This was a little bit worse 6 months ago. I thought that we were past this moment, but now with the issue with Turkey, he might just feel you're going to sanction me, you're going to deal me out of the financial system. Time you felt some pain too, and he might just decide to do some things that we never would have thought a real power would do. So in that sense, that might be the internet's most dangerous moment. If Putin just decides, I might as well just switch to disruptive, because what are you going to do about it?
Great. Sean?
Coming from my background, which is very national security centric, I think it's no surprise what I'm going to say here, but I definitely agree with Ellen on the threat of economic espionage and the long-term threat that poses to our country and our economic well-being. So with that, how already been taken by Ellen, I'm going to switch to I guess the increasing trend of destructive or disruptive attacks upon companies and sectors. And how we've seen a trend starting, I think, about 2012 with the Razgaz and the Shamoon virus, going through the DDoS attacks against the financial sector, to the Sony hacks, and even like the GitHub one that was more recently. Just seeing that is occurring, and there's a cost-benefit, cost calculus there, and there is really no downside, I think, that the people who are conducting these activities are seeing. And along with that, I think the proliferation of capabilities, and that there's not just a few players anymore that can do these types of things, and more players able to conduct economic espionage or conduct disruptive or destructive attacks. That's going to be a big problem coming in the next year.
Great. Great. So why don't we pick it up from there, actually. That's a good place to start. So how would you describe, you just gave a few good examples of the threat landscape facing companies, but what would you say should be the role in 2016 of companies? Do you think that they are better prepared to defend against these advanced threats than maybe they were this past year as awareness grows about the types of threat actors out there? Do you think that that's helping the interaction between the companies and the government?
I think they are becoming more aware. I think you're seeing this issue start to percolate more in the C-suite and on the boards right now. Probably not as much as it should, but definitely the trend is going the right direction there. And we are also seeing, at least on the government side, more requests for outreach and things along those lines from companies to receive further information about the threat and what they can do to protect themselves. I do a lot of outreach with the Bureau on this topic, and we are definitely seeing that uptick. Now, I think they are spending, the larger companies are spending a lot more money and devoting a lot more resources towards dealing with this issue because they have the resources to do so. And in the back of my mind, I wonder if that is going to lead to pushing the threat down to more mid or smaller size companies who might not have the same resources that a large company would have to deal with this threat. So I see that as an issue coming forth in the next year.
Great. And so Jay, from the 30,000-foot perspective too, how do you see the incentives maybe changing going into the next year on the part of nation states for targeting companies? There are a lot of discussions going on now about establishing norms and, of course, the G20 agreement, which we brought up in the introduction, and the agreement with China specifically on cyber espionage. But do you think that that's enough to disincentivize nation states from targeting companies for economic gain?
Well, one, I wouldn't necessarily pull out targeting companies for economic gains. I mean, companies get targeted for all sorts of reasons by all sorts of nations, including ours, right? I mean, if there's a company between us and Iran, they can expect to get a knock on their systems. One of the things that I'm really pleased about in this aspect for 2015 is that we haven't had other Sonys. That a year ago, fully a year ago. I mean, we had this incident with the Sony attack that might have changed the way that we thought about cyber conflict history. A kind of attack that we'd never really seen, not for commercial gain, but really just to take the company apart. We'd seen non-states do that, groups like SHAC, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, and some others that would really try and just disassemble the company. Of course, Anonymous and Lulz had tried to do that. Mm-hmm. And so it's nice that we're a year on, and that looks like, so far, it was a one-off.
Why do you think that is?
Certainly for nation states doing it, I think it helped significantly that the administration got China on board. They said, we don't have a North Korea problem, we've got or this isn't a cyber problem, this is a North Korea problem, and so let's try and solve this the same way we deal with other problems with Pyongyang, and the road starts in Beijing. And that helps create the norms that Ellen had brought up earlier. I mean, by bringing in Xi Jinping and others to say, Pyongyang, you ought not do that, you've now got China and the US that are agreeing that you ought not do that. And so I'm really pleased that at least some of the ways that things looked like they were about to get way worse a year ago, if someone was predicting, I can't remember from if we did, that you're going to see more Sony kinds of attacks, we haven't. It's been a year.
So do you think that, shifting over to China, do you think that China really is on board with this agreement that was signed this fall with the US?
I've called it writing on passcode, that it was a win-win either way. If they don't mean it, then President Xi lied to the face of President Obama. He lied to Angela Merkel. He lied to Cameron. He lied in front of the G20. And if we can't use that for diplomatic gain on our side, then shame on us, because he's now personally committed and publicly committed on this. And I try to remind folks that diplomacy isn't binary, right? It's not 1 or 0. If this decreases Chinese espionage by 10%, it is quite possibly the most successful thing that we've ever done to reduce Chinese espionage, even if it only drops it down by 10%. And look at how much other things that we have done, how much people that say we ought to attack them back, we ought to punch them, we ought to hit them. This has been quite, this ought to be a win-win.
And so, Ellen, from your perspective and your sources as you're doing your reporting, I mean, do you think that this is going to impact the way that that nation states are going to think about attacking companies, or do you think that and do you think that China is serious?
Well, on the latter point, I'm not sure how much influence Xi Jinping truly has in actually getting the message down to every element of both the PLA and, it should be noted, the civilian side of the House, the Ministry of State Security, which has, I'm told, actually more sort of professional and elite hackers who are able to, when they conduct their economic espionage, cover their tracks better, which has made it actually harder to also monitor what they're doing. And my understanding is that they continue to do the commercial hacking and maybe even have ratcheted up. So that is going to be an issue going forward, I believe, between the two countries. Jim Comey, the director of the FBI, just today in a Senate Judiciary hearing, was asked whether he thought Xi Jinping would live up to his pledge, and he said the FBI director is paid to be skeptical, and I've told my Chinese counterparts that. Now, that said, President Obama earlier this year established with an executive order, a new program to be able to impose economic sanctions on companies or individuals that conduct malicious activities in cyberspace, including commercial espionage. So if China continues to conduct economic espionage and essentially violating its pledge, I would expect the administration, before its term is out, to go forth and impose those sanctions. And then I would think that, given the new norm established at the G20, that it would have a better chance of holding, getting other countries to help them uphold those sanctions internationally, to freeze assets and not to have banks do business with these sanctioned individuals.
Can I, because I really like that Ellen's point there on Xi's effectiveness, because the stuff that we learned from Snowden was approved by Obama. I mean, if you look at the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, I mean, there were requirements, I'm sure, for all of the things that NSA went off and did. But I still bet that Obama, at the end of the day, was surprised and like, wait, I know I approved that, but you did what? Like, weren't. And because there's a difference between what the head of state or the head of a government, kind of approves and how that happens down at the tactical and technical level. So I can imagine that Xi might not know the full scope of what happens because he's never needed to. And so it might be that as this happens, because of the pledge, we now have more options to say, this is going to happen, this is what MSS was doing, here's our proof. They might not have told you this, but you don't have full control over your people. And that's a really powerful message to give to either you don't have control over your people or you're still going to suffer the sanctions. So either way.
Right. And so, Mark, we're all Washington-based, and you're over in the West Coast and California. And when you hear the news about this agreement between the U.S. and China, from a company's perspective, are you encouraged by this? Are you skeptical? What's your take?
I'm exceptionally skeptical,
Okay.
but very hopeful. And let me explain why. I'm a technologist. I'm not a policy person. I look at the threats every day and how many threats and where they come from and how do you protect against them. Today, I'm not seeing any downgraded numbers of threats. I haven't seen anything. The data will tell us. So this is wonderful to speak, and I hope it works, but the data will tell us. It doesn't talk about the rise of ransomware that's on a 137% increase this year alone, and that has nothing to do with the Chinese. So your data is vulnerable. And it would be wonderful if we could get the Chinese to play with us and we could have some sanctions and that will do something. But I'm not seeing any results yet. So we're waiting to see how that goes. But all the data I look at, the threats and attacks have not stopped. They may have in certain areas where you're looking, but they're certainly not in other areas. And I do think when you talked about smaller companies, they become ripe because so many attacks aren't even reported, as I'm sure we'll explain. People won't report an attack because what does that do? If I report an attack and I didn't properly prevent it, my capital in my company, my brand, is tarnished. And brand recognition is a big deal with companies. I'm in the inside protecting things. We do a lot of stuff, and I see what we're asking to protect, and I'm going, well, there's a reason we're being asked to come in. Okay.
And so I do want to ask you on the reporting aspect of this too, because as a reporter going to all sorts of cybersecurity conferences all over the country, you have members of the government from DOJ and from DHS and from FBI and really, and the White House. Everybody is coming and saying to companies, hey, we're here to help. Please report your attacks. Just Sony did it right. And we were able to, track it down and issue sanctions. And, we have prosecutions that we're working on. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But do you think headed into 2016 that this is going to, that you're going to see a change in the trust that you have between companies and the government, and that companies will be more willing to come and report? Or do you think that, and what's at stake if they don't?
It isn't trust of the government. I think the companies trust the government because they're on their side. They go to the government, ask for help. We often get asked to go help the companies that ask for help. What I see, though, is, once again, the marketing and the brand tarnishment. Companies are afraid of that. They want to work with the government because they know the government can give them some help. We deal with Secret Service, all different people in the government. They're doing a great job, but it's the brand recognition problem. So you can go to Gartner, Forrester, you can look at all the research data, all the analysis. You go to these cyber conferences, and no one's telling you that the problem is being resolved yet, right? So I think it's just a challenge. And I do think it's wonderful that the C organization, the CEOs are starting to get the message that they have to start paying attention to their security. And one of the biggest, there's three major threats to data. The malicious attacks, which we're going to talk later about encryption and why we should or shouldn't allow backdoors in encryption, but it doesn't say anything about the insider problem. The insider problem is significant. And then there's the errors and omissions problem that's from the insider, that our IT staffs are overworked and our security folks can't handle all the problems. So there's lots of issues, and they're not going to ever talk about the insider problem or the errors and omission problem.
Can I jump on that point?
Yes.
It's interesting that you hear about the brand and the threat that people feel to their brand, but I wonder if at some point, companies look around each other and realize, it's not scarlet letter if everyone else is wearing the same scarlet letter, and that the fact that this is happening to everyone maybe takes away a little bit from that threat. To the
Well,
brand.
if your point of sale device is failing at the gas pump and you're getting stolen, or if you're a target, because we just helped with that solution, and you're a mom and pop that live on $100 a month and you're paycheck to paycheck, and your stuff is getting stolen because you did Christmas shopping at a store, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that.
I've noticed that, I think you're right, with Target, didn't the CEO have to step down? It was a huge black eye. But contrast that with, was it Home Depot, where they actually kind of came out and got in front of the event, sort of acknowledged the breach, and I don't think they suffered the same sorts of consequences. I'm seeing more and more companies just sort of put out notices that they've suffered a breach and this is what they're doing, and they're offering all of this, identity theft protection, and this is the number of accounts whose data might have been exposed. And it's just becoming so much more routine now that a lot of reporters might not even report on that.
So if you announce it once, you're a good citizen. If you have it several times, do you keep announcing that you still have the problem?
What I'm
right?
saying
And
is,
you know what I'm saying? I mean, if you're Home Depot and you do a good job, and
Right.
everybody says what a great job, and then they get attacked a month later, and another month later, and another month. Do they keep going out and saying, "Oh, sorry, we got attacked again. We got attacked again"? I mean, it's a challenge.
I just think that there's been a gradual shift away from blaming the victim or seeing the company as, yes, people feel like companies should be responsible for cybersecurity, but they also understand that this is such a widespread and pervasive problem that really, what company hasn't been hacked?
It's interesting. It sounds like, Ellen, you're saying that going into this next year, we're already seeing maybe more best practices for breach disclosure in a way, and what how do you actually handle this on a corporate level? And then it sounds like, Mark, if I understand you right, you're saying that that the companies are still really feeling this, and I mean, it seems like this is something that we're going to have to.
I'm saying that the citizen, the average person on the street, has an expectation that when they give you their information, you're going to be responsible and protect it.
Well, so
And if you don't do that, they'll give you 1 or 2 passes, but they can't keep giving you all these passes.
But
They're
it's
going to
also
just expect and demand you do a better job.
It's also a liability issue too, and Congress passed an information sharing bill this year, and assuming that will be finalized in the next weeks, however long it takes to hammer out these differences in bills. But I mean, to all of you, do you think that we're going to start to see the impact of this bill, that we're going to see more healthy exchange of information between the private sector and the government this year, and will it actually help prevent security breaches or address some of these feelings of harm to your personal brand?
I certainly haven't paid any significant attention to the information sharing bills because I just haven't seen that they're going to, and I was the vice chairman of the Financial Services ISAC. I mean, we were at the center of information sharing. And when I ask folks, well, how does information sharing actually help? I usually get, well, it floats all boats, the information gets around. But we largely know what needs to get done. I mean, how does information sharing help if we know it's at 80 to 95% of the attacks are using known vulnerabilities? I mean, I'm just not seeing how the information sharing works at scale to get us in a significantly better place. The defenses are already largely in places like McAfee, Symantec, and other places that already have a lot of this information. So I'd rather be focused on how do we stop these kinds of attacks. Now in this, I've had to eat my words a little bit because I've also tended to say it's the private sector that's going to be the cavalry that comes in almost every case, and you don't get much out of sharing to government. And then they caught the J.P. Morgan Chase guys. I mean, and so I had to actually eat my words on that one a little bit because I had never thought we were going to get names on that. So it's one of my 2015 lessons. I've been a grump when I've said, well, what good does having the law enforcement comes in? It's not necessarily on the critical path to getting to a solution, and we got arrests out of it. So I've had to eat my toupee on that one.
And Sean, do you want to weigh in from the prosecution side of that?
I mean, the message I always deliver when talking to companies is that it has to be a joint effort. There's lots of information that the private sector has, the U.S. government doesn't have access to, especially if you're a victim. You have a lot of facts that the U.S. government probably is not aware of and has no reason to be aware of. And unless there's some sharing going on like that, it's very hard for the government to then use its tools that are unavailable to the private sector to go after and identify the people who are doing this, or to take steps to prevent this, technological steps, or prosecution, or whatever tool the U.S. government has at its disposal. So I mean, I am a huge fan of information sharing between the private sector and the government. Again, I'm biased, I'm sure, as many of you believe, but I just don't think it can be done alone on either side.
So do you think that it will lead to more prosecutions in the coming year? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the J.P. Morgan arrests and what you think the impact of this might be in terms of creating a disincentive for hackers in the future.
Well, as far as the information sharing, I'm not sure that the legislation would affect that. I think the information sharing between the Department of Justice and victims is something that normally occurs without legislation, and so we're a very victim-centric organization. So on that line, I don't think the legislation makes a big difference. I think the J.P. Morgan case, which was done by the folks on the on the criminal side of our house, was a very big win for law enforcement. Again, I think the law enforcement has a lot to offer in that regard as far as offering a deterrence option. It's not the only tool, but I think it was good work, and I hope, obviously, at least on the national security side of the house, we have similar successes in the near future.
I would say that the Information Sharing Act, while it may not go far enough, it's a great first step, because what it does do is tell folks on the companies that they can go to the government and I need some help. And without the government telling the technology companies where the problems are, it's hard to go build solutions. Mm-hmm. So we've seen a good willingness to work with some of the agencies to say, this is the problem, this is what happened. Do you guys have any technology, and not to one company to open to everybody to make it fair and competitive, but do you guys think you can solve that? And I think you need that, because we need to know where people are attacking, and if everything's kind of done behind closed doors, you don't know how to prevent. So I think that's very, very helpful to have.
What more do you want to see on this front?
I think that continued sharing of the problem and showing people where they're attacking and say, do you guys have anything? Does anybody have anything that can prevent this? Now, once you have a successful attack and you protect against, they'll move on. but you can then make sure that those areas don't get attacked again. And after a while, you start to eliminate those problems. And the attackers go where it's easy. They don't go where it's hard. So you make it hard, you raise the wall, raise the bar, and you do that. And the government can also help you. You know, I know we're going to have this encryption debate, which I'm looking forward to. But the government should be saying, go encrypt your data. Go encrypt your data. And they ought to be fining you if you don't encrypt your data. But that's my own personal opinion.
I'm sorry, I know it's Ellen, so I'm stepping in here a little bit. But I like it because you covered two ends of that. And I'm always looking for how we can get defense better than offense. What can we do that's really going to scale?
Right.
And so I think like cloud scales, encryption the way that you've talked about scales. And to me, when I say how does information sharing get us to a scale that really makes a difference versus information sharing just so we can now protect 1.5 million endpoints, 100 million endpoints. Of every company taking this information and then having to fix themselves. That's one reason I'm so skeptical on it, because we now have to depend on every enterprise to take this information that's shared and then act on it. And so I always try and focus in on what are the big problems: denial of service attacks, botnets, APT. And some of these, and saying, all right, so what's the key information that decision makers need or people need to act to stop each of these individual kinds of vectors that are coming in and affecting us. So instead of saying, hey, let's share information, we say, in the past, what have been the decisions that we've done and actions that have most taken these down? What information did we need that we didn't have? What information then needs to get shared? This should start from a national cyber incident response plan that says, how do we stop these? Then we say, what information do we need to affect that response? Instead, we still don't have an incident response plan, and we've been fetishizing information sharing because we thought it was going to be easy 5 years ago to do. Sean,
you looked like you had something that you wanted to add in.
I was just thinking of the information sharing, and you often hear that there might be some hurdles to information sharing, and I think as folks, I think, have mentioned antitrust guidance or antitrust concerns, and when I think people in the policy circles of the U.S. government heard about that, they issued guidance saying that you should not be worrying about that. Or if you aggregate data and share it for defensive purposes, that you're not going to violate the Stored Communications Act. And then there's the FTC guidance as well recently. So I think if as far as information sharing goes, if the supposed hurdles to information sharing are identified, there's lots that the U.S. government can do to knock down those hurdles and to push those aside and say that's not a real issue and here's why. And then that gives people some guidance going forward.
From my understanding is the big ask here was to get immunity for companies against lawsuits. Now, what I hear from folks inside the government is that they think in the end this information sharing is not the silver bullet, but may help around the margins with some firms who would be right now reluctant to share without that immunity.
So speaking of the government, I do think that we should talk a little bit about OPM, which was the huge breach of this year, compromising personal records of some 22 million people.
Including everyone in this room.
Probably, yes. So how big is the threat of another OPM scale breach in 2016? Or do we think, I might know the answer to this question, what we think about it, but do we think that the US government has done enough on its own cybersecurity to prevent this? Jay?
I just counted like 5 people sniggering in the audience. No, I can guarantee we're not going to hear another one of these in 2016. I guarantee it, because we won't discover it until early 2017, and then the only folks that are going to be talking about are Ellen and the other journalists, and then the government will fess it up. In 2018, we're going to hear about
the OPM breach actually began in 2013, right? Yes. So was it? Wait a minute. 14.
We'll put this in a time capsule for the Cyber Risk Wednesday 2 years from now.
So learn about it on Passcode in the Washington Post. We've known the attack has the advantage on the defense. Determined attackers are going to get through. That's been true back to 1979. Was one of the facts that we uncovered when I did my history book, and so of course these are going to continue to happen. The one that, like, if we're looking for scare headlines, I'm less worried about it happening here, because it'll happen and we're kind of used to it. India is now well through, probably 800 million, I think was the last, full biometric data, fingerprint, iris, and I think at least one other kind of biometric, for every single Indian citizen. They're trying to get absolutely everybody into this. They have at least 800 million. And we've now got this place where it looks like we have the, is it a norm that it's okay to go after this? It certainly seemed, you heard from General Clapper and General Hayden that this was the normal thing that would feel okay. If you're the Ministry of State Security, if you're Pakistan ISI, if you're CIA, and you can now get the biometric data on 800 Indian citizens that's been helpfully collected for you by the Indian government, I mean, imagine the impact that we're going to have on the trust for this underlying system with that.
Yeah, it brings up a really interesting point because the testimony you're mentioning is just, I mean, intelligence leaders are often saying, you know, let's not throw stones if we live in glass houses as well, which brings up this question about norms. And do you think that in the coming year we're going to see progress on determining what exactly is an acceptable amount of cyber spying or what is unacceptable in this space? Ellen, you look.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the norms is don't get caught, because I think had the OPM hackers actually done their work from within the United States and the U.S. had identified them, you know, they'd probably be, if they were spies, they'd be, you know, PNG'd or they'd be kicked out, or maybe there would be a spy exchange. It's just that because they're doing it from overseas under sort of traditional intelligence, against which there is no real, you know, international law. It's sort of hard, as you said, for the U.S. to throw stones, which led to Clapper's sort of quip about how he said you got to give them credit to the Chinese that they actually did it. And Mike Hayden, a former CIA head, saying, hell, if he had had the chance, he'd have done it himself, and he wouldn't have even called downtown to ask Mother May I. So, you know, that's one sort of attitude towards this sort of espionage, which has other lawmakers on the Hill scratching their heads at, what do you mean? You know, this is just one of the most significant breaches of data in government history. And it may be traditional espionage, but it still is, you know, it's not acceptable. There should be consequences. So, and Sean, maybe you can speak to this, but the government keeps saying, you know, we may be doing things. It's just that some of this we can't speak to publicly when it comes to holding, you know, China accountable. So
I can say we're not doing that at DOJ.
Sure.
The question about OPM, you have to wonder, why did they want the data? I have a personal interest in this because me and many of my people, my company, has information taken. So there's a real problem there for those of you that have that. But why did they want that data? What are they doing with that data? What else was attacked? Healthcare companies, do you put everything together? You do data analytics. What solution do you come when you look at all the government people that have security clearance and anybody that may have a problem in healthcare? How do I, if you just want to tie that line together and say, gee, can I go with somebody that has a sick child or somebody? Can I go turn that person? These are real issues. So now you ask about, will any other government agency or organization have this? Well, what was the real problem at OPN? I never even heard one senator or congressman ask, was your data encrypted? I'm sorry, I keep going back to that, but no one asked it. We got a program that'll come online and eventually will give us a prediction of how long we've been broken into. Like you said, we'll know a year later, right? I think I saw somebody here from FireEye. They come out and tell you 256 days before you even know anybody's inside you. Okay. So what other government groups are solving, do they do the same thing? Are they doing the same thing that OPM do? Are they doing anything different to change that from happening? So that's the question. I don't know those answers. I mean, you'd have to go down to each group and ask them, what's their scores on cybersecurity and protection?
Well, after OPM, the government did have the cybersecurity sprint to improve its, you know, defenses. But maybe, do you have one thing in mind that you would want the government to still do to improve its cybersecurity? Also, open up to anyone else who wants to grant.
Once again, technology guy here. We live in a world of network centricity. All their data is protected around the network. The firewalls, intrusion detection, all these things we try to measure and monitor who's coming in and how fast can we tell they're in and shut them down. We're not network centric. And data comes in securities and layers. And if you don't put all the layers in here, you're just kidding yourself. So if you don't add to the next layer of network centric, you can defeat so many of these challenges that get through the network centric with data centric. So you need to put these things together. And so I think the government should be pushing everybody to get on the bandwagon and start using network-centric solutions. And there's some phenomenal ones out there that will shut things down.
Jay, do you want to add
And
something on this?
I always did scratch my head a lot with some amount of fury when I would hear how bad OPM was, because it was a valid intelligence target. I was a signals intelligence background. This was an absolutely valid target of government HR. And I had to hear from a lot of my SIGINT brethren when, after the Snowden revelations, of, oh, these people that are complaining, they just don't understand signals intelligence. These were legitimate targets. And whoever's complaining about this just doesn't know how the game is played. And then the game gets played on us, and things are different. And the feeling, if your data got taken, that feeling that you get when you get that letter and you see, that's how the rest of the world felt after the Snowden revelations. That sense of, they've collected my data? Who's they? What are they going to use it for? What comes next? What can I do about this? That's what the rest of the world felt. And this town said, yeah, deal with it, everybody. This is the way the game is played. Now that it's our data, our SF-86s, my SF-86, now's the time to get outraged. Now it was us personally.
In fact, if I can just jump in on that, of
course.
my
I'm a grump on
understanding
this point, sorry.
is that, in fact, that outrage really affected so many administration levels so personally that they conveyed that anger to China. And China, the Chinese officials were so convinced that that was the thing that was upsetting the U.S. the most, that prior to the summit between Xi and Obama, they, in discussions with the two sides, the Chinese were sort of rushing to mollify the U.S., knowing that the U.S. was considering economic sanctions, and they, I think, were thinking that the sanctions were in part a response to OPM. And so my understanding is, offered to try to find out who was responsible, because in part, she was saying, Chinese were saying, wasn't us, it wasn't us, it was not the Chinese government, trying to make the case that it was, hackers, opportunistic hackers or criminals just getting the data for themselves. And so offered to try to find the true culprits and round them up. My understanding is that they eventually did arrest a handful of individuals, but whether or not these are really the ones who were responsible or linked to the hack, I don't know. And whether China will actually follow up and prosecute, I certainly don't know.
Well, Jay said we're in an arms race. That's what I heard. We're in an arms race, cyber arms race. So the United States has been in an arms race as long as I can remember, read my history. So if we're going to be in an arms race, we need to be in an arms race for cyber, and we need to arm ourselves with the best protection we can for our data. And if the SIGINT world wants to say that's too bad you get hacked, fine. We'll go arm ourselves so we can't get hacked. And that's what we need to go do. And the technology's out there. There's great technology that can help you, and that's what we just go do and move on. Next, it shouldn't be a national issue. It's just as basic as, it's basic stuff.
So Sean, I do want to bring you in on this as well. So, just building on the idea that people want to see, people felt personally affected in Washington and beyond and wanted to see somebody held responsible. And maybe these people are the people who carried out the attack that the Chinese arrested, or maybe they're not. But from DOJ's perspective, what are you guys doing on this issue? And do you expect, if these people really are the people who carried out the attacks, what would you like to see happen next?
So on this issue being cybersecurity or OPM specifically?
OPM specifically.
Well, I think it's tough sitting in my chair to talk about ongoing investigations. So, but I would say just as with regard to the cyber threat generally, like we are constantly playing the attribution game, and it's a difficult game because as we get better at it, the people who conduct these activities get better at hiding their tracks. But I think the attribution game is, from a DOJ side of the house, we're doing this not just because for prosecution purposes. We have a hammer, but not everything is a nail. But I think the attribution is key to a lot of the other responses that the U.S. government has, whether it's sanctions, diplomacy, designations with other regulatory authorities, or maybe prosecutions. So that's how we are approaching it, is just really trying to get better at the attribution game and kind of get better than our adversaries at hiding their attribution. So that's really what we see our goals for the next year, I think, as far as how to address this type of threat generally.
So at the risk of just pressing you one more time on this, so we have Ellen's article, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room, if not everyone, has read, where the Chinese did apparently arrest a handful of individuals who were who they say were responsible for the attack. I mean, what do you want to see in terms of collaboration between the Chinese government and the U.S. government on something like this? I mean, if these people were, do you want to check them out yourself, or should they be sent? Do you expect that anybody will ever be sent to a trial at any point or for further investigation?
Well, the U.S. and China don't have an extradition treaty, so I imagine if they did identify the criminal hackers they say are responsible for the OPM intrusion, that they would not send them to the United States. That being said, I think it would be a win if they did in fact identify the actors who hit OPM. It would be a big win for the United States government. I think the United States government would provide them with information if it would prove helpful. But.
Mm-hmm. And so just off of Jay's talk about this being a legitimate intelligence target, just moving to targets that are perhaps less legitimate. This summer, the United Nations group of governmental experts, including representatives from China and from Russia, agreed that there are rules of the road in cyberspace during peacetime and that countries should not damage each other's critical infrastructure with cyber attacks. And so I'm just wondering, going into 2016, Jay, do you think that the threat to critical infrastructure remains the same, or does you had mentioned right at the beginning of the event how countries' capabilities and the ones that have capability don't necessarily have the intent. Do you see that shifting, or do you see that how do you see the UN news from over the summer affecting this?
It's going to be driven by for that kind of high-level attacks that you're talking about here. For real critical infrastructure takedowns, it's driven more by geopolitics than anything else. Like my comment about Russia. I mean, generally countries don't do this against one another because they know if they do, there's going to be real hell to pay afterwards, because they're crossing into military space and they can expect a military response regardless of whether the action was conducted by ones or zeros. So that's though the attacks are relatively easy to predict because you can just keep your eye on what's happening geopolitically. That said, the norms happen incredibly quickly. We went from almost none that were really accepted. The U.S. didn't even have ours publicly out there in March. And then April, we announce ours, Secretary Kerry in Seoul. Then we have the UN group of government experts. Then Xi and Obama. Then Xi and Merkel. Then Xi and Cameron. Now G20. I mean, that's an incredible pace for diplomacy. And hats off to our State Department for getting that far. And so I'm a big fan of that. But to some degree, I also feel like when I see Syrian negotiations, right? I mean, when we talk about what should happen with Syria, any negotiation is great progress of starting to bring people from the table, but it doesn't necessarily stop the hell that's happening in the actual networks or in Syria itself. So we've still got a ways between where we've got the really to help these norms and help those network defenders and those that are going after the data and the rest.
Right. And so I know that we are going to leave some time for audience questions, but I do, because Mark has brought it up a few times, have to ask about encryption, the hot topic of certainly the last few weeks. Companies like Apple, as we know, have strengthened their encryption on their consumer devices as a best practice to protect consumers from malicious hackers. And law enforcement officials have for a long time been warning against what they call warrant-proof encryption. And so I want to turn over to Ellen. You reported this fall on the White House Review and how President Obama was, for now anyway, opting not to force firms to find ways to decrypt their data. So it's just interesting the last few weeks because after Paris and the San Bernardino attacks, there seems to be some momentum going the other way where you're seeing not just law enforcement, but senators on the Hill and even President Obama potentially alluding to this issue in his speech on Sunday. So what do you think that this debate is going to look like in 2016, and how do you see this being affected by things in the news? Is it going to just continue to swing back and forth like this?
Yeah, I think the Paris attacks and the San Bernardino attacks have both altered the climate, or emboldened, in particular, security hawks on the Hill to come out and really push for, say that they believed there needed to be legislation on encryption, mandating some form of, if not backdoors, ways that companies would make encrypted communications and devices accessible to law enforcement. But the administration, at this point, is still not saying they're calling for legislation. They've told me that they haven't drafted anything. They are talking to lawmakers, and lawmakers such as, I think, Senator Feinstein and maybe Richard Burr, the vice chairman and chairman, respectively, of the Intelligence Committee, are looking at legislation. Feinstein said as much today, and she said, if no one else does anything, I'm going to introduce them. But one thing is, we still don't know if any of the Paris attackers actually used or communicated with encrypted devices or communications, and whether that hindered or thwarted investigators. We still don't know whether the two attackers in San Bernardino used encrypted comms. They had iPhones, but we don't know if they were the more recent versions or whether they were using encrypted apps. So if it turns out, in fact, that they were using encrypted communications, that could alter the debate.
And so, Luke, I mean, how have you seen the terrorist threat evolve in 2015 online, and what do you expect to see next year as that relates to encryption?
So I think as far as the evolving of the terrorist threat, they have gone from using the internet and cyber as a propaganda tool till I think just recently this year we saw them not use it just for a tool, but also to obtain information to target U.S. government military personnel. And I'm referring to the Ardit Farizi matter and the Junaid Hussain matter that came to light in October with the arrest of Ardit Farizi in Malaysia. And that's a significant evolution, and you can rest assured they don't want to stop there, and they want to keep moving towards greater destructive attacks or cyber-enabled attacks that cause loss of life, whether it's a SCADA system or whatnot. Whether or not they have the capability now, it's an open question, but definitely rest assured they're trying to get there at some point. As far as the encryption debate, I think it's a very sensitive subject, to say the least. I think we just have to avoid the extremes in the debate on either side and just recognize that there's room in the middle and probably can find a solution where lawful authorities can get at the data for lawful purposes.
Jay, did you want to add anything?
I'm going to leave some of the back door to Mark, because we talked about it beforehand. One is, I'm not so worried if I don't think it ought to drive the debate whether or not Paris terrorists use encryption or not. We all know the direction of the technology is taking us, and whether they did or didn't, we know in 5 years or 10 years that they will, and let's be looking forward in our public policy. To me, it's maybe even less of a question of the encryption than just the proliferation of apps that are out there. Mm-hmm. They've got so many different ways to communicate, and we know they're savvy enough to avoid the ones that they know are being monitored. So if we do give new powers to monitor, we then have to think of what are they going to do next? What are they going to migrate? How do they monitor that? What do we do when we have terrorists on Tinder? And I'm not kidding about that. I mean, what do they do if they say, you know what, we're going to use Tinder to communicate, so that way, we can each swipe and then we can communicate with messages. Are we now going to have FBI or NSA that's monitoring? I mean, how far does this go with the proliferation of communications technologies that we're going to continue to chase them down every hole? Does that scale? Can we win that going down as far as that goes?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's avoidable. To be honest,
you've got to find other ways to investigate. I mean, you're going to get to a point where the Bureau is gonna lose if you're now on Tinder and Grindr or TikTok or other places and saying, wait, you're monitoring for X, Y, or Z, or you have to have the companies do it. And is that really, are your kids really going to have an internet as one that you do right now if we are monitoring 100% of every channel of everything everywhere in the world?
So Mark, I'm going to let you weigh in on this, then we're going to turn over to audience questions. But so big picture, I mean, what do you think is at stake for companies if they're with this encryption debate going in the next year?
I think we always want to synthesize it down. Encryption, or have backdoors or no. There's many pieces to encryption. So there's the communications, encrypting the communications so we can listen and find bad guys. That's one piece of it. Right? There's another piece of the data. Are we going to make that everybody that encrypts their data has to have a backdoor key? Think about that. I just said earlier that it isn't just malicious warfare we have to worry about. We have the insider problem. So now we're going to take all the keys and have them held by a company, whoever owns that application. And we're not worried about a Snowden at that company? We're not worried about that being passed along? We ought to be, because it will happen. And we just mentioned before, just errors in omission. It can just get out through errors in omission without even meaningful to do it. So there's lots of ways to make that encryption unsafe anymore. Now, is the bad guy going to create his own encryption and give you a key for his backdoor? They can create your own encryption. It doesn't take, we have so many smart people out there that are bad guys. A quick story, a few years back, the Colombians built their own submarines, $100 million submarines to deliver cocaine. So the bad guys are going to make their own encryption apps, their own plays, and they're not going to give anybody a backdoor. So what you're going to do is you're going to have all the good guys giving all their stuff, and then run the risk of having the proliferation of those keys, and the bad guys are just going to still be securing their stuff. I know it's a problem. We have to do something. But you may want to think about the communications piece first, as opposed to all the data, and break that down into sub-pieces and say, well, if we have to have something, we have to be able to listen. We have wiretapping. We have all these legal things. You get the rights to go listen, and you go do it. But I'm not a fan of encryption of data, because anybody that's in the technologist knows you have a backdoor, I can penetrate it, and very quickly. And if you think you can't, come see me, and we'll point you to some people that we can do this near instantaneously.
Great. So with that, do you want to turn over to audience questions? And I think we have some mics going around as well. And yes, we'll go right here.
Thank you. Randall Fort with Raytheon. A quick comment, then a question. Jay, when you ate your toupee, I hope you didn't eat the whole thing, because the numerator of how many times something has happened is maybe single digits, and the denominator is in probably, if not the billions, and certainly the hundreds of millions. So one or two examples of the government, stepping in is not terribly confidence-inspiring for the hundreds of millions of times when people have been attacked and had information taken. My question is for Mr. Newell. Another trend this year has been the government actually going out and taking hostile regulatory action against companies. We have the SEC versus RT Jones Capital Equity Management, and we have the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, versus Wyndham, using their various powers to effectively prosecute companies that, in their opinion, did not do enough for cybersecurity, for cyber audits, and so forth. So is this a part of the government's strategy? Hi, we're from the government. We're here to help. We may share, but if you're not doing some standard that these various regulatory agencies have decided, companies are going to find themselves at the end of a very painful regulatory stick?
Concern you just relayed there is something we hear all the time when we go out and talk to victims. They say, yeah, great, you're telling me all the right things, DOJ, but what happens when I share my information with you? I'm just going to have the FTC or someone come hit me with a stick. I think that is, they see these cases and they are concerned about them. What I can say is, I think, the FTC has actually done this online on its blog, is said, if you take steps like cooperating with the government investigating what happened and things along those lines, we look favorably upon that. I don't think the SEC has come out with something similar, but I think as a very victim-centric organization, DOJ, we like to work with victims to ensure that they come cooperate with law enforcement, they're going to get hit over the head with a stick. Obviously, we can't do that for victims that we aren't talking to and cooperating on investigating what happened to them.
But on the one hand, we've said the market hasn't worked. The market for security hasn't worked. Companies aren't taking this seriously. But I've tended to like these actions because this is the kind of way that we say that the market works. I mean, we've got these other mechanisms by which to say, if boards aren't doing the right thing, then there is going to be some penalties for that. And so on one hand, I kind of haven't minded because these are regular market mechanisms. Do you want to move down one so that we're
okay?
Yeah. Okay. So we don't have a big gap there.
Sean on the right over here.
Hi, Sean Lingus, FCW. Thanks for the panel. A question for my namesake on the panel. You said that attribution is getting better at FBI. I'm wondering if you can comment on that in light of the IG report from 5 months ago that said the information that the FBI was sharing with the private sector was found to be stale and lacked context. And the private sector said, sources told the IG that, quote, sending something to the FBI was akin to sending information to a black hole because they often do not know what becomes of it. That doesn't strike me as a collaborative track record with the private sector, so I'm wondering what you're doing to improve that.
So I actually was not familiar with that IG report, but I do know that that same message, whether or not it originated from the IG report or that was the impetus for it, has been heard. I think the U.S. government as a whole is really trying to ensure that they aren't providing stale information and that they are providing context to that information. I think there's been a lot of information sharing just in the last 6 months that might not be where people want it to be, but it's definitely a lot better than where it was a year ago. I think also one thing we hear that when we go out and talk to victims all the time during our criminal investigations, and one thing we tell them is, yes, we've heard that before, but we are, and we actually have done this in practice, we are committed to providing information back to you as our investigation progresses. It will enable you to better protect your network. Now, we might, if you tell us information about what happened to your victim, we're going to go out and investigate and try to attribute that hack. During the course of that, we identify other tools that these same actors are using to target you or to target your peers and might come back to target you a second time. We are trying to feed that information back to the victim so it is not a black hole, and they are getting some sort of information benefit from this cooperation they can use to better protect themselves while we are out doing our work on the investigative side.
And I'm a grump when it comes to what government can provide versus what private sector could do for itself. But there's been two places where this administration, I think, has set defaults in a way that's been very helpful. One, not after the incident, after law enforcement has gotten involved, but setting the precedent in public policy that if the U.S. government knows a company has been owned, that they will tell them. That is the default. I think that is an incredibly powerful statement of public policy that's the default position. And likewise on keeping vulnerabilities. Last April in the White House coming out and saying, if we discover vulnerabilities on our side, or if we buy them off the gray market, for NSA or CIA, for example, that the default position is we will give them back to the vendor. And in fact, we had Admiral Rogers up at Columbia University last month, where he said 91% of the vulnerabilities that have come into NSA's hands, they've gone to the vendor on.
But it doesn't say whether they use the vulnerabilities first.
I would be, it's a White House process. So the question, Sean said yes, but they didn't say whether to use vulnerabilities first. It's part of a White House overall process that's run by Michael Daniels' shop. I wouldn't say very surprised. I'd be rather surprised if the White House process allows you to go ahead and use it on the side before it goes through. It's possible, but as a matter of public policy, I would think Michael Daniels' shop would want to clamp down on that.
Anyone else with a question? Yes, maybe we go to the middle and then to the left there.
I think there was a young lady back there also.
Jonathan Lichman from the Providence Group. I wanted to just go back to the question that sort of follows on the regulatory question and information sharing generally. We hear about hacks, and the media covers the ones that are very public, PII, PHI, because it's a law that you have to disclose. But there is an awful lot of activity that's not disclosed, and in fact, the indictment of the Chinese PLA, the reporting is that Justice had to twist some arms, Westinghouse and others, to get the information to actually pursue the prosecution or the indictment. And so my question is, if boards and CEOs need to have information to understand even what their threat is, but a vast majority of the activities that go on there's no requirement to disclose, how are we ever going to be able to get a real understanding of what the threat environment is?
Anyone want to take that?
I'll jump in. I think the SEC guide, I would think that we really want to look at looking at the SEC guidance and make it mandatory. So the SEC, well, it was 3 years ago now, said if you've had a cyber incident that was materially significant, then the board of directors needs to look at that and and tell, or should look at that and tell investors, and should because it was guidance. And I loved it. It was like 6 pages, and it's one of my favorite bits because they didn't say we're going to tell you what material significant is. You're the board of directors. You hire lawyers and figure out what materially significant is. And if you're hiding it and if you're not telling people, then you're going to be held to account just like anything else that materially significant that you hide from your shareholders. And it's 6 pages. It was one of my favorite little bits. And so I think they would be very interested to see making that mandatory. Because to me, that's just board member responsibility. I would go further in kind of this market, and I've said this before on this stage. If I could convince one person to take this seriously, this is only partly tongue-in-cheek, is Warren Buffett. I mean, whenever I hear DHS going and trying to convince a board, I'm like, that doesn't scale. If we could just hit and convince Warren Buffett to say, every one of my companies, I will use the cybersecurity framework, and I will not invest in a company if I don't think they've taken care of their intellectual property, then you are in every business newspaper. You will have convinced every board. If Target didn't convince them, you now have every board. And there's a great, this was done by, I think, a London law firm. I can't remember which one. They talked to deal makers involved in mergers and acquisitions. And they talked, so the lawyers and the bankers, and something like 75 to 85% of them said, absolutely, cybersecurity matters when we're going to do an M&A deal. And then they said, well, how many of you actually look at it? And it was like a third. So they know it should matter in an M&A deal, and yet they're not paying attention to it. So one, I'm saying business opportunity, baby. And but also, like, if we really want to get the market to matter, then let's get those numbers to match.
Mark, do you have anything you want to add on in terms of making this mandatory?
Well, I think you know where I'm going to come down on this. I think it definitely, if you're an investor in a company and your data is not protected, why are you investing in the company? You spend millions. I have over 300 patents myself. And if you have millions of dollars we spend in our company on patents and we don't protect that information, and that's not protected, all that IP, you're just giving that to everybody else. And that's what you're spending all that money in your company to let anybody have that information. It would be not a good thing, yes.
Can I ask, are you seeing that cloud is helping that overall as people go to cloud, that it's tending to find better?
So couple top issues with cloud, right? Mm-hmm. Security, number one. Number two, security. So it's a challenge with cloud, right? But people are still using it because cost is a big deal. Mm. So they're fighting that there's a natural tension between I've got to use something that's cost effective, I don't have the money, and I got to get security. So companies are working hard to get security into the cloud. And as I mentioned before, that 35 zettabytes I talked about, I love to talk about those big numbers, but a third of all that is going to go right through the cloud. So that Internet of Things is a lot of it's going to be in the cloud. It's going to be a data analytics. So this has to be required to be protected. I think there should be legislation. Instead of legislation to put backdoors and encryption and keys, there should be legislation to protect your data. That's what we should be that should be a national agenda. That should be in the forefront. I don't know if did that answer the question?
Great. So we had a question in the back there as well.
Hi. So I've been studying cyber attacks, cyber security from a law point of view, an international law point of view. So my question may be a little too specific, but I'll try to broaden it out if it gets too specific. So I've been reading that it is considered use of force if it is an attack to land, to property, life, or health. So in this case, it was only to be considered use of threat if these 3 aspects are affected, and if not, is the state not responsible? And so that would be the specific question, but just to broaden it out a bit, when is a state responsible and when is it not, when it is launched from its territory and affects another territory?
Sounds like
Yeah,
a
I mean,
Jake
so
question.
so the fan came on right when you
Right.
started asking that. So if you all of a sudden saw us
can't
kind
hear
of, it wasn't an E.F. Hutton moment. So and it's kind of two questions. I mean, so one, when's use of force? When is cyber use of force? And then when's the nation responsible for the attack coming from its territory? If I get those right. And so one, we are so much better off than we were 2 years ago on this because now we have the Tallinn Manual that came out. It was the international lawyers that came out. Mike Schmidt was the primary author that said, let's look at every aspect of the international law and let's try and figure out what the best current answers are. And actually, Atlantic Council and American Bar Association launched this book when it came out. Actually, probably 3 years ago now, and it really does a great job. And so I suspect, for example, if the United States ever goes to war and drops munitions based on a cyber attack that's happened to us, if NATO ever declares an Article 5, there's going to be dead people and a lot of them from the cyber attack that hit us. Now, from a law standpoint, could we get to that point where we would be that angry if it were merely an economic attack? We might. You can imagine it, not if the power is out in the Northeast for 3 days. If the power is out in the Northeast for 18 days because of a North Korean cyber attack, for example, once we're at the 18-day point, yeah, we'll go ahead and we'll attack. But in general, yeah, you're going to need the kinds of effects for blast, heat, and fragmentation. As far as how far the nation has to be, generally, cyber attacks at that level we don't have the attribution game as bad as we do when the attacks are less severe. Because they're taking place in a geopolitical context. If a nation is going to hit another nation or allow another nation to be hit, then it's not going to be out of the blue. It was pretty obvious, the authorship, for example, of many of the Estonia attacks, that at least Russia was willing to ignore that these attacks were going to happen. And if you've got 100 dead bodies because of the cyber attack, the veil attribution is going to turn out to be really, really, really thin. If you're betting America's not going to do something because you can't prove where these ones and zeros came from, I think you're going to get surprised. And Clara Jordan, one of our favorite international lawyers, is sitting right behind you, so she can answer the question for you.
Sean, did you want to add anything on this?
Just from my perspective, I mean, everything you said absolutely makes sense to me. I think, obviously, as a knuckle-dragging prosecutor, a lot of these decisions about where red lines and stuff happen well above me. But I can tell you, it's not easy. It's not an easy decision, or it's a very contentious debate, I'm sure. So your question, the answer to it is not easy.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are buying the knuckle-dragging prosecutor thing. I mean, I think that just doesn't really work.
I try.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, on the aisle here.
Hi, Nathan White with Access Now. I have a question for Mr. O'Hare. Earlier today, I wish Helen were here for this.
Can you speak up? I mean, we've got this fan right here. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. In the Senate Judiciary today, Director Comey said, "Good news, I've been talking to the companies and they say the going dark problem is not a technology problem, it's a business model problem." I was just wondering if you had a response to that. If you weren't watching it, Director Comey obviously has been complaining about going dark for a while now. He wants to mandate that companies be required to unlock or unencrypt data if served with a warrant. While testifying today, he said he's been talking to a lot of companies and he's determined that it's not a technological problem, it's a business model problem. He seems to be citing Google, that you sent an email.
So my comment is it probably has an interesting technology staff, and they probably need to go back and be retrained. So it's politically it sounds wonderful, but that's not. I don't buy that at all. Technology can do anything. Technology can put back doors in everything. Technology, if you have a back door, the problem is if you have a back door, it is a threat vector, a security term. I apologize, but that's where you're going to go attack. You're not going to go spend your time anywhere else. You're not going to even worry about anyone else. You're going to go right there and attack it, and that's a vulnerability. And how are you going to protect that? Part two of that is that, as I said earlier, the insider threat is a real problem with data theft. Mr. Snowden was an insider, and the numbers are pretty significant on how big the insider threat problem is. So if you take all these back doors are keys. Encryption has a key, right? Text, an algorithm, and a key gives you cyber text and a key. You put that key somewhere, and now that's the key that unlocks the cyber text. And then if I take all those keys and wrap those in another key, because you're not going to have millions of, you have millions of files, I'm going to have a master key. Well, who's holding that master key? Where's that master key going to be kept? And what part of the debate is that have that master key available, so if I call you up, you have to give me that master key. That sounds very logical. The government will be fair. They'll only come in and look when they need to. But who else has access to the master key? The bad guy will come and find that master key and get it. And so there's always some business issues. The business issues is that people want to sell their products and solutions to folks, and they don't want to buy them if they know you can get a back door and get all my information. So that's a civil liberties thing. That's a your rights thing. I don't know if it's a business thing too. If I sold a product and said, well, it really isn't everything I say because everybody can get that information, anything you want. You're not protecting anything. If your bank statements were made available to everybody, is that a business issue with the bank? If the bank came out and said, your business statements will be published on the net so everybody can see them, would that be a business issue? Well, that would be a customer issue. The customer doesn't want everybody knowing their bank information. So I think trying to protect all this data with security is phenomenal. There's technology out there. You can shut these guys down right now. There's things you can do that you can't break. We've proven over billions of years to break things. Life of the universe, you can't get into this information. If we give you back doors, it's nanoseconds to get in. And so is that a business discussion? I think it's more of a protection of your information discussion.
And I love that point. And the way I've thought about it is very similar. We've got to, the folks that are doing encryption are building a wall, and they want that wall to be as strong and as well protected and as difficult to get through as that wall can possibly. There's not a lot, I watch enough Game of Thrones, there's not a lot of ways to attack a wall. If you're trying to attack a wall, there's not a lot of ways that you can do it. As soon as you put a door in the freaking wall, all of a sudden, there's all these other threat vectors that you can now try and attack that wall. And I've been influenced by the 3 Bs on this, Matt Blaze, Steve Bellavin, and Bruce Schneier, of saying, look, the attackers are beating us in every area and always have been. The one place that aids the defenders, the one place the mathematics is on our side is on encryption. In that one area, we are stronger than they are. And so now, in this one place, our one shining diamond of hope, we now say, because of the dangers, and I've talked to detectives, that have had homicide cases go, that have stopped, SIGINT brethren that can't follow folks they know are dangerous. My heart goes out, without a doubt. I can imagine what that's like. But with extreme caution, we should take this one area that we're actually ahead of them and say, let's deliberately weaken that one area where we have our strength.
And let me take it a step further. You should really go beyond encryption. So just encryption isn't enough. There's quantum computing coming on, things that are going faster. You need to go beyond encryption. You need to cryptographically split your data. So your data is virtual, bits are everywhere, they're no one place. That is where your data is really safe. That is serious data-centric security. And it's very easy to use, very easy to install type solutions. Everything has to be easy to install. With the advent of field programmable gate arrays, acceleration, I'm not giving any commercial here, but one of the things we do is we do security of data, but we also are involved with data acceleration. We set the world record in genome analysis in 9.2 trillion cell updates per second with 19 PCE cards, not a supercomputer. So there's technology out there that can do all sorts of things. There's technology that can take these surveillance algorithms we work with, and which took months to do something, we can do it in 1 second. So a lot of those things can be solved with technology. Your data can be more secure with better technology. So you have to go beyond encryption.
So I'm getting the signal that we are out of time, but I just wanted to, first of all, be around after the event. But I do want to ask one quick, very quick question to each of you. Not next year or in the next 5 years, are we going to be more secure online, or are the threats always going to continue to outpace the solutions that are being developed? So really, like 15 seconds each. Mark, your thoughts?
I would say cryptographically split your data, you're going to be more secure. If you don't, you're going to be less secure.
Okay. Not just an encryption, just broadly, big picture.
Almost every trend is showing controlled flight into terrain, so.
Okay.
I think it's going to be a continuous back and forth over the next couple of years. So the advances, then let's fall a step back. Kind of the attribution game. They get better, we get better, they get better, we get better.
Just need to know whether you guys are optimists or pessimists in the end. So.
Optimistic.
I'm optimistic, but there's so much data, the challenge is keeping up with it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to everyone for coming and to our panelists.
Thank you very much. Very nice job. Chair, very nice job.
Thank you.